Hi, this is Jim Feist. It's 2013 Tourney time. We got the NCAA, of course, and there's 68 teams with some play-in games down to 64. Then we got the NIT, the CIT, and the CBI, which are relatively new tournaments that have been around for just a couple of years. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I approach tourney time. Now, of course, when I'm playing the NCAAs, we're playing mostly neutral court games. The NIT are home games, CIT's home games, and CBI are home games for the most part. So you approach these games differently. But we're going to focus right now on the NC2A. At this stage of the season, we move out of the conference games, and that's a big difference. We're going back to where we were in pre-conference, which was back in October, November. No longer will I be looking at those games with very much importance, because these teams that are playing now are going to be playing at different venues and against different opponents that they're used to playing. This creates many adjustments for players and coaches, not to mention odds makers, handicappers, and bettors like myself. While this creates more work in terms of research and the hours of study, it also provides an opportunity for those who are willing to do the work, have access to the material, and know how to analyze it. Let's begin where I begin. There's a process that I go through, and I'm going to walk you through this to a conclusion. I'll probably add some addendums along the way later on, but right now I'm just going to focus on these items. Number one, I completely ignore what a team did back in November and October, believing teams either grow or decline in performance as time goes on. The only two exceptions from this philosophy is that if two teams meeting today met several months ago. I make this exception because revenge and matchups can be very valuable in my evaluations. Exception number two is not as important, but I do consider it. That is, I look at common opponents that are not conference opponents from months ago, especially if those teams are top teams. Like, for example, let's get a middle team like, say, St. Louis or a VCU, and somewhere in the beginning of the season they matched up with an Indiana or a Gonzaga or a Duke. How did they play at that level of competition? We know they're better teams. We know they're not facing those type of teams in their own conference. So this is kind of important to see how do they act when they play as a team against a quality team. I do look at that because segueing into the next thing is strength of schedule is very important. Some conferences are much weaker from top to bottom than other conferences. There may be one really good team in that conference. For example, this year Gonzaga is a really good team, but the rest of their league is not. But if you go to the Big East or the Big Ten, which, whether you call it the Big Ten or not, there's a lot of very good teams in those conferences. Well, so that strength of schedule comes into play. It's something that the pundits talk about a lot with good reason. Every year we hear about dark horse teams that can break through and go far in the tournaments. Frankly, this does happen occasionally, but it's still very rare. And if you bet on all these supposed dark horse teams from the beginning, you're going to lose more money than you win. Yes, occasionally you're going to get the George Mason or, some of these VCUs from years ago, and they take off and they go all the way to the Final Four or Final Eight. Well, the champions don't come from these lower-end conferences. I can't remember any that have come from the lower-end conferences in my experience. Now, the point spread does matter. So when you're talking about teams, whether they're better or not, you've got to look at how strong these clubs are against the spread. If a team's supposed to get 10 and they're getting 13, well, you have some value there. So you have to look at that too. So we're not only looking at dark horse teams to win straight up. We're looking at them, more importantly for me especially, as to whether they can cover the spread or not.